morning. It's a real pleasure for me to be here, to be with you in year 15 of the IAPP. It's amazing to me because every year this conference brings together more people to talk about issues that are more prominent and focus on work that is even more important than the year before. And every time I pause and think that maybe we're reaching some plateau or even peak, we're all proven wrong, and the issues grow more prominent and important still. It reminds me of the immortal words said by this person who I will bet almost no one in this room recognizes. Charles Dickens. In 1859, he penned two of the most memorable lines in the history of literature when he said it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And in some respects, I believe he could have been talking about the state of privacy in our own time. I think that there are big opportunities ahead for data and what we can do for the world. You saw some of that captured this morning in Alec's book. As we think about the industries of the future, the companies of the future, the activities of the future, there are going to be exciting opportunities in the physical world, the biological world, and the digital world. And interestingly, regardless of what part of the world it involves, it almost always is going to be connected to the cloud. I think it's worth pausing and reflecting on the opportunities this creates to change almost everything in some kind of beneficial way. I see this in the work that I get to do. Take one of humanity's oldest inventions. Agriculture was invented 23,000 years ago. And for 23 millennia, people have been doing the same thing. They have been planting vegetables in the soil. But using cheap sensors and the Internet of Things and data, it is now possible to grow vegetables this way. And what is most interesting is that in a world that is addressing climate change, in a world where there are water shortages, this form of agriculture can require up to 90% less water, made possible in part by the cloud. Or take another invention. It was 13,000 years ago when humanity invented coins and currency, and it became possible to buy things and save money and borrow. And yet even in our own day and age, even this morning, there are 2 billion people on the planet who still do not have access to banking. Using the power of the cloud, a company named Temenos is basically realizing that wherever there is a phone, there is access to a bank. In just the last 18 months, they have brought banking to 10 million new people, and as we look to the next 5 years, it becomes possible to imagine closing the remaining gap. Or think about a third and final example, an invention from 3,500 years ago, writing. And as soon as humanity invented writing, it became important to read. And yet, even in our own day and age, there are people who struggle with reading. There are people who have dyslexia, and yet we see a company in Sweden, Optolexia, using inexpensive eye-tracking hardware connected to machine learning and the power of the cloud to make new advances, as you see here.
Mamma säger, nu ska vi ge oss iväg. Pappa säger, aj, mitt huvud.
If you have undiagnosed dyslexia today, this is going to affect your whole life. Not only is your reading skill poor, but it also affects your confidence and your motivation in school.
Our vision is that every pupil should have the right kind of support in school as early as possible.
Screening methods today do not measure reading performance at all.
The Optolexia screening tool is based on actual reading. So what we do is let the children read a short passage of text, and we record the eye movements using an eye tracker. We have been using Visual Studio to develop the client for recording eye movements. These eye movements recordings are sent to the cloud and are processed using machine learning models to look for patterns that differentiate a normal reader from a dyslexic reader.
The customer needs to trust us that this is a secure solution This is sensitive data.
Microsoft has helped us to take our method from being a research product to something that we can actually do live in school. And here we have the possibility to help children become better readers and to improve their lives.
I think in a nutshell, that shows how big data has the opportunity to bring big advances and real improvements for people, and yet also why the sensitivity of data will be more important than ever. And in a sense, that points to the other side of Dickens' phrase. These are also challenging times. And one sees this in the events of our day. One sees this in the events of particular days. Certainly one of the more momentous days of the last 2 years was on November the 24th, 2014. It was a Monday morning, and in Los Angeles, millions of people got up the way they do every Monday, and they drove to work. And some people drove to work by going through these gates at Sony Pictures Entertainment, little suspecting that they were about to become part of what Fortune magazine would call the hack of the century. And even as they got to work and found that their computers, their email, their documents were not accessible, little could they imagine that the events of the ensuing weeks would take their company across the Pacific to North Korea, and the conclusion that they had been the victims of a state-sponsored cyber attack. Even then, little could they imagine that events would continue to propel them forward across the Pacific again to Washington, D.C., where on December the 19th, 2014, the very last thing President Obama did before boarding Air Force One to go to Hawaii for his annual vacation was give a press conference and say this.
Again, I'm sympathetic that Sony, as a private company, was worried about liabilities and this and that and the other. I wish they'd spoken to me first. I would have told them, do not get into a pattern in which you're intimidated by these kinds of criminal attacks.
That, as much as anything else, reflects the degree to which the world has changed. Because I can guarantee that the engineers and computer scientists of the country and the world, the people that you advise, the people that I advise, never went to a university course that had a class called What to Do When Your Work Becomes the Subject of a Presidential Press Conference. And yet there's more somber aspects of the world in which we live as well. We see this in other days, like November the 13th of last year. It was a Friday, and in Paris, people started their Friday evening the way they often do. They were out in the streets. They were out at dinner. In a cafe on the Boulevard Voltaire, a man walked in at 9:30 in the evening and he sat down at the counter. He calmly ordered his dinner, and 9 minutes later, he blew himself up. Within seconds, the streets of Paris were filled with the sounds of sirens and the sights of police cars, and the next morning, the Boulevard Voltaire and other streets looked like this, with flowers mourning the victims of the night before. And yet a few weeks later, on December the 2nd in San Bernardino, California, the sights and the sounds were similar. There were police cars in the street by day, and mourners that evening commemorating the 14 people who had lost their lives. Within days and weeks and months, we saw the connection between those events and the issues that we work on, as people asked new questions about surveillance, about encryption, about the Apple case, a case that proved that everybody we meet, anywhere we go, is likely to ask us what our opinion is and then share with us their own. We live in a world where the pendulum can swing back and forth. And I think more than anything, all of these issues and events and trends call on us to ask one fundamental question: what do we want to stand for? I won't presume that we should all stand for the same thing, or even that there is only one right place to stand. Different companies have different business models, different countries have different cultures, but I think all of these events call on all of us to ask and answer for ourselves this question. I'll share with you this morning one person's views on where I think we might consider standing. and if nothing else, share with you what I think the issues are that speak to us in our day. I think first we do need to stand for the proposition that we will continue to keep people safe. That's why in the tech sector, companies across our industry have come together to bring cases to rid the internet of botnets, to work with state attorneys general and other officials around the world to address tech scams. It's why we made clear a couple of weeks ago that in the wake of the Paris attacks, we had received 14 lawful orders from the police in Paris and Brussels asking us for information. We were able to comply, we did so, and we did so with an average turnaround time of under 30 minutes. But if we're going to keep people safe, we also need to keep information secure. That's why when the question was posed, we at Microsoft felt it was important to stand with Apple. I think that's why the whole tech sector united to stand with Apple. And although the case is over, the debate is just beginning. And we are all going to find ourselves involved in the discussion, not just in this country, but around the world, probably between now and the end of this decade, working through the questions that surround the use of encryption. These will be critical, but there's also other aspects and other issues that are critical as well. I think we need to continue to stand up for transparency. That's why we at Microsoft were one of several companies that sued our own government, the United States government, in 2013, arguing that we had a constitutional right under the First Amendment in the United States to share more information with the public about the national security orders that we received. As somebody who's been a lawyer for 30 years, the case that we brought to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court was like no other I had ever been involved in. Most courts, they have a courthouse, they have an address, they have a phone number. You call the phone number, somebody answers. In this case, it's all different. You call the phone number, this is what you hear.
You have reached the United States Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Please leave a message.
The legal process was different. In other courts, you file a brief, you wait for the other brief to come back so you know what the other side is arguing against you. In this case, we got the brief back, but when we opened the pages to read it, we'd never seen anything like it. This is why we didn't stop with the court. Across our industry, we took our issues to the White House, and it's why we were all gratified when President Obama on January 17, 2014, went to the Justice Department, gave the speech in which he's depicted here, and put our country on a path to surveillance reform. And even though we're not finished yet, even though there is more work to be done, we are moving forward. And I think it's important to give credit where credit is due. Companies across our industry have taken new steps. Google was one of the first, and it led the way in showing many of the rest of us how we could publish better and more transparency reports. The EFF has been a prod to all of us, and even though there are days when I ask myself, why are we being prodded today in this direction? It's all part of an incredibly healthy and important dialogue. It's part of what has led us to take more advances as a company ourselves, to publish more transparency reports. We also need to look beyond transparency. We need to stand up for enterprises, for many of us, the companies for whom we work. That's why we at Microsoft thought it was important, as did other companies in our industry, to go forward and get certification under the model clauses and provide more benefits to enterprises in Europe. It's why we brought a case in federal court in 2014 challenging a subpoena from the FBI that sought the email content of an enterprise client. It was and remains our view that when the government wants content that belongs to an enterprise, it should go to the enterprise. It shouldn't go to the cloud service provider. It should give the legal departments of the enterprise itself the opportunity to look at the order, decide whether they want to comply, or go to court if that's the right course of action. This issue is not over. There will be more in the coming weeks and months, and I think this too will be one of the prominent privacy and surveillance issues of this year and our time. We also need to look even beyond enterprises, and we need to think about and stand up for people globally. As I come, especially to Washington, D.C., as I go to meetings around town, I find myself constantly reminding people who work here of one fundamental fact. Only 4.5% of the world's people live in the United States. We have a responsibility to the world and to the people of the world, and we need to think about that responsibility every day. I think we need to think about what we're hearing from the rest of the world. And even when we don't always agree with everything, it is just so important that we understand where people are coming from. That's why I thought it was so interesting and important after the European Court struck down the safe harbor to listen to the voice of one of the more interesting individuals who has spoken out, Max Schrems, and listen to him say this.
What is it that you're afraid these companies are doing with your data?
We have the basic problem that we have the mass surveillance scandal and we didn't really have any consequences in Europe. There were like angry letters by politicians, but nothing really happened. And the idea was really to go after the companies because we, as Europe, we don't have any jurisdiction over what the US is doing on the internet on mass surveillance. But they need these companies to help them to get all this data. And the idea was to go after the companies because, for example, Facebook, the one that was in this case, is operating 82% of their worldwide user base out of Dublin, which falls under European jurisdiction. There you can actually say, if you aid foreign spy agencies, that very likely conflicts with European fundamental rights, and that was pretty much the case that was brought.
In effect, as he made clear, he couldn't sue the United States government, but he could sue U.S. companies, and he concluded that in some cases, the U.S. government might be getting its data from U.S. companies in the first place. In a nutshell, it shows the challenge we have in rebuilding trust, including across the Atlantic. That's why the Privacy Shield is so important. It's why I believe it's the right first step to take in strengthening privacy across the Atlantic, while we also recognize that there will be other steps that we will need to take in the years that follow. No single legal instrument can address all issues for all time, but it is so important that we continue to move forward. As we do so, we need to think not only about what happens to European data in the United States, but we need to think more about what happens to European data in Europe itself. As we've found in our lawsuit that started on this island, Ireland, in this building, this data center, we concluded that we needed to file a lawsuit, as we have, to challenge our own government's assertion that it can use unilateral search warrants to reach any email content anywhere in the world. As long as it wants it, it can get a magistrate to say it can get it, and it has jurisdiction over the company that has that data inside. That, in our view, goes simply too far. And as we move forward with this fight that I think may well end up later this year or next before the Supreme Court, we've benefited from the broad support of many of you inside this room, from people from 28 technology and media companies, 23 associations and advocacy groups, 35 of the leading computer scientists in America, and the government of Ireland itself. The day those briefs were filed together was probably the only day in the last 5 years when the ACLU and Fox News were actually on the same side. That shows the breadth of support that we have. And it's interesting because this too is an issue that is moving to other places. One saw it a month ago on Capitol Hill when the witness for the DOJ appeared before the House Judiciary Committee, and he had the opportunity to listen to this.
The country of Ireland decides that, in fact, you committed a crime, and they want yourself back there. Should they be able to simply unilaterally go to an Irish court, issue a warrant, and come get you?
So if the country of Ireland submitted an extradition request for me?
No, not an extradition. No, they just want to come haul your ass in.
I would oppose that, sir.
Okay, so in the tangible world, that's an example where we have absolutely no authority whatsoever to take a person, by the way, US or otherwise, from another sovereign country. Right, but let's just look at the intangible world, the piece of paper reduced to a PDF? Because that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about something that could be tangible fairly quickly, but happens to be in electronic format, correct?
Certainly.
Okay, and you want us to assume that somehow, as to US corporations, Microsoft, Apple, whoever it happens to be that, in my opinion, is being bullied by the Justice Department today in some ways, you want us to believe that you should throw out all the history of extradition, all the history of you don't get it, you get to ask another country for it, and you want to have an absolute right to demand it and get it if a US court says it and you have jurisdiction over the entity who could control the bringing of it back electronically to you. Is that correct?
Unfortunately, the DOJ's answer is yes, that is correct. That's exactly what they want. And that does go too far. But I think we need not only to stand up and object to that, we need to offer new solutions. And here there is cause for hope. Hope in a new bilateral agreement that is being negotiated this year between the United States and the United Kingdom. And I think there's hope in new business models like the data trustee model that we have created in Germany, where an American company, Microsoft, doesn't actually access the data, but a German company, T-Systems, does. Interestingly, we found that when we announced that, it was news not only in Germany, it was news not only in Europe, it was news around the world. The next morning, when people got up in Asia, they turned on CNBC and they saw this.
Microsoft threw the tech industry a curveball overnight, announcing a German data plan to tackle U.S. internet spying. Let's bring in Akiko, who's been poring over the details of this one. Akiko, I gotta think that the reason that they would set up data centers in Germany, and I'm sure Germany likes the idea because at one point America was hacking Angela Merkel's phone and she was really upset about that. This is sort of a reaction to Ed Snowden, isn't it? I mean, to keep it away from the paws of the American NSA and those people?
Yeah, absolutely, Bernie. You know, American companies have really struggled to regain the trust of its customers abroad in the wake of that disclosure from Edward Snowden on NSA surveillance. And this agreement from Microsoft certainly could have sweeping implications for the tech industry.
It has once again injected us into the mainstream of a great deal of conversation. It has sometimes required that we step in to try to set the record straight, to explain what we're trying to do, what we're not trying to do, as I found myself trying to do the day we announced that.
So let me be blunt. By doing this, whatever sort of may be the philosophical view in the grander scheme of things, but it does deny the US the ability for surveillance of that data.
Well, actually, what this does is give Europeans the confidence that if they choose this option, their rights will be protected by European law. Things will have to go before a German government or court, and the United States government can continue to work in a lawful way by interacting with other governments, in this case, the German government. But it will be done pursuant to the international rule of law. That is what all of this is about. It's about ensuring that we live in a world that is governed by law, that we have an internet, and that we have a world where data is governed by law. But as we all recognize, we need to modernize the law. We need good law. And this is a set of issues that I believe will likely occupy everybody in this room over the course of the next decade. As we engage in these debates, as we work to modernize the law, we also need to keep in mind one other thing, I believe. We need to practice what we preach. And this is something that so many of you are spending so much time advancing in so many good ways. It's what led we at Microsoft yesterday to launch a new privacy hub and unveil new privacy principles, to make clear not only what we stand for, but the way we're going to stand for these principles and move our technology forward in a way that enables data to do what data should do, to serve people, but also does so in a way that enables people to do what they deserve to do, and that's know and control what data we have and how it's being used. As we think about the future, it is clear we are all going to need to participate in a broad conversation, broader than the conversations even that have taken place in the first 15 years of this organization. We are going to need to work together as we do that. And as we do so, let's keep in mind three things. First, privacy is an issue. In fact, it's not only an issue, it is one of the defining issues of our time. Second, as all of you reflect, privacy is a profession. In fact, as you can see today, it's one of the most rapidly growing professions of our time. But more than this, perhaps more than anything, I believe that privacy is and should be a third thing as well. Privacy is a cause. It is a cause worth embracing. Thank you very much.